Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Food Systems Resiliency webinar series. My name is Lynn Schmidt-McQuitty, and I'm the Strategic Initiative Leader for the Healthy Families and Communities program within UC-A&R. And today, along with my colleague, Dr. Deanne Meyer, the Strategic Initiative Leader for Sustainable Food Systems, we're really happy to have you join us for this webinar series on the beef industry and how it's been disrupted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we start into the actual presentations, we've got just a few reminders that we're going to be recording today's seminar for future education and promotional opportunities. We'd like you to please remember that you're going to be muted to prevent any background noises. We have two options for conversation today. You can use the Q&A box, which would be then directed questions to the presenters or to the panelists on the presenter panelists, excuse me. Or you can use the chat box for more general information or for sharing or conversations that you want to have with others. Keep in mind that you can either chat to just the panelists or to everyone in the Zoom room. So we'll be using those features to move forward as we go through the seminar today. Next, please. As you may be aware, we're having a variety of webinars looking at the food systems, really with an opportunity to try and reimagine our food systems around production, processing, and accessibility. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has made us realize that there's a lot of opportunities to develop new partnerships, research projects, and synergies across not only A&R, but also with our stakeholders out in the community. So we're hoping that this webinar series will provide you with some information as well as inspire you to develop new relationships and partnerships with others looking at similar areas of interest to you. Next slide. Our goals or objectives for today are really to look at improved knowledge and understanding relative to the food system, to identify and share available existing electronic information, so resource kits and things that we can use to apply to our own work, to identify information gaps, and then also to brainstorm next steps relative to partnerships, program ideas, or potential research. Next, please. Next week, or our next session, excuse me, will then be taking place on September 8th, and it will focus on thinking inside the box, farm boxes, and local supply chain resilience during the pandemic. So if you are not aware, we are offering these webinars on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month from 10 to 11 a.m. So we would encourage you to participate and tune in to the remaining sessions that we have as well. Next slide. Kicking us off this morning, I'd like you to meet Tracy Shore, who is a natural resources and livestock advisor in Quincy, California, which is Plumas and Sierra County. And she is our panel host today, and she will kick us off and introduce us to the remaining members of the panel. Tracy?
Thank you, Lynn. As Lynn mentioned, today's seminar is really looking at the beef supply chain and market disruptions. 2020 has shaken up the beef industry across the nation, from global trade to national processing and local beef sales at the farm gate. Today we have four featured speakers, Dr. Tina Saitone, Caitlin and Kirby Swickard, and Morgan Doran, who are all going to talk about a deeper look at the beef production system, processing, direct sales, and ranch-to-table operations. And like Lynn said, my name is Tracy Shore, and I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor in Butte, Plumas, and Sierra counties, and I will be serving as the moderator. Our webinar today is going to kick off with Dr. Tina Saitone providing a look at national market disruptions that impacted California beef producers over the past 6 months. Dr. Saitone is a Cooperative Extension Specialist focused in livestock and rangeland economics in the Department of Agricultural Resources and Economics at the University of California, Davis. Tina?
Thanks so much, Tracy. I'll let you advance. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for participating today, especially in light of all that is going on in our state at this time. I really appreciate it. At the end of this presentation, I'll provide you with a link to my social media pages, but here you can always find more about me on livestockecon.ucdavis.edu. Slide, please. So today, for this webinar, I'd like to provide you with a 10,000-foot overview of the beef supply chain to add some context to how the COVID-19 pandemic really created a bottleneck in beef production and the ramifications both for downstream consumers, so what happened to wholesale and retail prices, as well as what happened upstream from beef processors, specifically for fed cattle and feeder cattle markets. Slide, please. So I just want to provide, so that we all are talking in the same terms about the supply chain, a little bit of context. So this is a depiction of the vertical beef supply chain, starting with cow-calf operations. So a typical cow-calf operation manages a commercial herd of beef cows that are bred to produce calves. Those calves are raised by their mother's side on rangeland or on pastures until they're weaned at roughly 6 to 8 months of age and weighing about 500 to 650 pounds. After weaning, those calves are then sold to stocker operations, sometimes also called backgrounder operations, via local auctions, sometimes satellite video auctions, or via contracts. Those animals stay on backgrounder operations for at least 6 or until those animals weigh about 800 to 950 pounds. The majority of cattle in the US are finished for the last 4 to 6 months before slaughter on concentrated rations, so grain-fed essentially, until they reach a market weight of somewhere between 1,300 and 1,400 pounds typically. At that point, those fed cattle, that's how we refer to them at that stage of the supply chain, are sold to processing operations that harvest those animals, turn them into cuts of beef that are then sold to grocery retail and food service. Slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about meat processing and beef processing very quickly, just so that it adds some context to what happened during COVID. Processing in the United States has a highly concentrated, or what we would call horizontal, ownership structure. So if we're thinking about beef, the top 4 firms harvest about 85% of steers and heifers in the country. They're also concentrated substantially geographically. So if we think about commercial cattle slaughtered, about 75% of it is conducted in just 5 states. So Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, Colorado. These are very large facilities and have a large dependence on labor. So meatpacking in the US employs about 525,000 people nationally, and that's about 30% of all food and beverage manufacturing employees, just to give you some context about the size of these operations. They're dependent on labor specifically because of the variation in cattle carcass sizes. So that may be partially due to genetics, partially due to time on feed, but there's very little mechanization in these plants. They're highly dependent on laborers on what we call a disassembly line, cutting up carcasses into specific cuts. So on March 31st, that was the first instance where a beef processing plant actually closed due to COVID-19. If you could tap that button. This created a huge media frenzy with meatpacking operations across the US attracting substantial interest from the popular press, from policymakers, health officials, consumers, because these plants were identified as hotspots for COVID. And it kind of culminated when Tyson's CEO declared that the supply chain was breaking and predicted widespread meat shortages for consumers. So this chart, you can see the months of the year on the horizontal axes. And on the vertical axes on the left-hand side of your screens, that's millions of pounds of federally inspected beef production. So at the height of plant closures and slowdowns in disassembly lines, you can see at the beginning of May, production had decreased about 40% if we compare to the same week in 2019. This created a substantial bottleneck in the supply chain. So if you can click once, Tracy. So it created an oversupply of fed cattle because cattle were not moving through processing plants at a normal rate. And it created an undersupply of beef products available at wholesale and at retail. April 20th, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act, which declared meatpacking facilities across the country critical infrastructure and got production on somewhat of a rebound. So it should be noted that critics of the invocation of this act are worried that doing so increased the spread of COVID-19, but ultimately, regardless of that, it did improve outcomes for beef producers and mitigated anticipated meat shortages. So you could see after that dip in production in early May, slaughter has rebounded somewhat by essentially the beginning of June. Slide, please. So just to mention a couple things about additional struggles that processors had with meeting demand. The majority of restaurants and food service operations obviously were suspended during shelter-in-place orders. And so beef processors initially struggled to process cuts of beef for grocery retail instead of food service and restaurant operations. So that was an initial shock to the system. Also, there's been a lot of commentary about we have a lot of frozen beef in storage. How could we run out, essentially? And we wouldn't run out per se, but frozen cuts in storage are not easily repurposed to meet that food at home demand because these were intended for export and are typically different cuts or larger cuts that is challenging to thaw, butcher, and then bring into conventional grocery stores. Slide, please. So ultimately, so what? Slide. We're going to talk first about downstream impacts. So we saw prices of beef and veal comparing June 2020 to June 2019 increase about 25%. So at the supermarket, consumers were paying more for the beef that they're consuming. Slide, please. But on the flip side, if we consider cattle prices, so this graph is what we call the cutout value, or is the gross value of a beef carcass based on the prices paid for the individual items that compose that carcass. This really shows the wholesale market for beef. So you can see when plants were idled and shut down, that early May period, we have this huge spike in wholesale prices because fed cattle were not flowing through the plants. So we had a shortage of beef, and that created this large spike in wholesale value. Slide, please. Here you can see essentially that same pattern, but what this shows is the price spread. So this compares the wholesale price that processors got for beef with the price that was paid by processors for fed cattle. So this is what we would call a margin or a difference in those two prices. And you can see processors' margin, so the amount that they took in, increased substantially during this period. If you can click, Tracy. This has prompted a lot of controversy. There's USDA investigations. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are investigating concentration in the market. And it's also prompted a variety of bills to actually be proposed to dictate the procurement methods used by processors. And I'd be happy to talk about those in more detail later. Here's a picture of what happened in the fed cattle markets. So you can see when plants were shut down and idled, prices really started to fall. So we see a 22% decline from January to that late April period when plants were running at 40% off of their previous year's capacity. Slide, please. Here's a picture of the fed cattle market that's probably more relevant for our discussion about California ranchers, because these feeder cattle are lighter cattle that are further away from slaughter. And here you can see this is the futures contract traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. You can see in February that was trading at about $152 a hundredweight. It declined 24% to the time when it bottomed out in April. So this mimics that fed cattle market very well. Slide, please. So just briefly, some aspects that are very California specific. Slide. One factor that producers are dealing with in California is drought. So primarily we have cow-calf and stocker operations here in California. And so one way ranchers can try and deal with these lower prices that are COVID related is to hold cattle longer. But every day they hold cattle longer, those cattle have to be fed. And that's typically done on rangelands and pasture lands at this stage of the supply chain. But this year, California does have a relatively widespread drought with only 33% of the state not in some kind of drought condition. So that limits producers' ability to hold cattle longer until prices improve. Slide. Very briefly, we're also in California not close to the feeding and processing capacity in the Midwest, which means that holding quality constant, ranchers in California are going to get lower prices for their cattle. And we also have typically higher operating costs, so costs of regulation and also opportunity costs. So when ranchers are put under significant economic stress from black swan events like COVID, there's certainly a risk of them losing their operations and that land being developed and reducing the economic viability of rural communities. Slide. Just to wrap up, uncertainty is certainly going to persist as we all try and predict the future of COVID. I think we've all been wrong many, many times. We still have a backlog of fed cattle, which is going to keep prices below what they would typically be in seasonally and in terms of geography, spatial pricing. We have a packing plant workforce that appears to be stable right now, but if there is a resurgence of COVID, we could see a bottleneck in the system again. And one thing we should note is that if COVID really does throw our economy into a significant recession, the lower consumer incomes are, that's historically been linked to reduced beef demand. Slide. So I think that is all I have. Here's all my contact information. If you have questions we can't get to in the webinar, please feel free to email me, visit my website, or touch base on social media. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing insight into the beef supply and market disruptions over the past 6 months. If you look in the chat box, you'll see a link of a longer presentation that Tina did diving into this topic more, and you can also visit her website or follow her on social media for regular updates. Our second segment of today's webinar is the producer side. Sisters Kirby and Caitlin are part of the 7th generation of Swickard's ranching in California. Both grew up working on the family ranch in Susanville, California, and continued in a full-time capacity after college. The family raises conventional beef and also has a vertically integrated operation called 5 Dot. Today, Kirby and Caitlin are going to share with you how their operation has responded to COVID at the ranch level to the butcher shop.
Hi there, my name is Kirby. I will be speaking first about just ranching during COVID, how it's affected on the ground, and also our employees. So from a ranching standpoint, definitely something that we always are working on is just being adaptable, because we can't control the weather. There's so many different things that ranching requires that we is completely out of our control. COVID definitely being one of them. As Tina mentioned, we definitely saw a backlog of cattle due to shutdown of harvest facilities. And with the drought, we were fearful of the future and how the summer would shape up due to a lack of feed. And we weren't sure what that was going to look like. And this is our commercial herd. So that was something we were definitely worried about. As far as our employees went, they usually, we were fortunate because they usually work independently. They're outside a lot of the time, most of the time. And so for them, being outside, not really working amongst others, there wasn't a lot that we had to implement as far as making sure that they were staying safe during that time. We did implement a lot of protocol, especially when employees were needing to be around each other, encouraging them to stay 6 feet apart, making sure that they were wearing masks when interacting with one another. And in our office, we implemented those as well. So we also encouraged employees to self-report if they were feeling ill, or if they had any sort of symptoms that might be related to COVID, to report them immediately. And then we would go through the necessary steps in reporting those to the county health department, and also, following CDC guidelines. Lassen County, where we do most of our ranching, fortunately was not hit very hard with the virus. We had very minimal cases. In the beginning, we didn't have any for a very long period of time. So that also was something that worked in our favor. Probably where we saw the biggest impact was on our restaurant side of the operation. If we could switch the slide, that would be great. Next slide, please. So we have a branded beef product. It's been 12 years in the making, and we started off in farmers market, and eventually we landed here at the Oxbow Public Market in Napa, where we have a butcher shop, and then we also have a cookhouse. The butcher shop was opened 12 years ago, and then we have the cookhouse, which was opened in 2014. You can see here in this image some adjustments that we had to make in the actual cookhouse. Typically, we would have people sitting at the counter. We would have people milling about the market. You can see our employees are wearing face masks. We had to implement those new policies and make sure that they were, we had less employees in the space so that they were able to remain distanced from one another. The face coverings are always required. In the restaurant industry and also in the butcher shop side, constant hand cleaning is always something that they're doing anyways. So that was something they were used to, but we did require them to wear gloves as well. In the beginning, it was unfortunate. In March, we had to furlough most of our restaurant employees because we had to shut down that side of the operation completely and come up with a new plan moving forward. So that was really something that gave us great heartache at the beginning, just having to do that to our employees. But once we were able to come up with a new plan, restaurants were allowed to open up. We implemented a more of a takeout menu and just, again, had to adapt. It definitely has not been a straight line to where we are now. It's been a roller coaster as far as figuring out the new guidelines, recommendations for being open in the restaurant. The Oxbow Public Market itself also had its own sort of rules and procedures that they were implementing, and a lot of all of this was by trial and error. So, we would take 5 steps forwards and then 10 steps back periodically. So we had to change our menu, making it more takeout friendly. When we did start bringing employees back, we gave them the option of returning, whether it be in a full-time or part-time capacity based on their comfort level. Most employees, after being out of work for 6 weeks plus, were very excited to come back to work. And we introduced all of our new COVID protocol to ensure that our workplace was as safe as possible. In ranching, we were already prepared to be adaptable. So, in this, we definitely, we were worried at first, and we still remain, worrisome based on how this could shape out through the rest of the year and in the future. But again, we just remain vigilant, make sure that we're following all recommendations from the county level, state and national, and we just do what we can to ensure that our employees are safe. And we talk to them regularly, making sure that they're feeling comfortable in the workplace, making sure that they, their needs are being addressed, and that they are that they are happy in what they're doing and feeling secure. So it's required a lot more communication and a lot more that we've had to work around, but we're making it work, and we remain hopeful, but also fearful at the same time for what the future holds, definitely from a ranching standpoint and from a restaurant standpoint, two very volatile industries. So we look forward to just continuing on this journey, and we'll see how it ends up. I'm gonna turn it over now to Caitlin, who's gonna talk about our wholesale and retail programs and how we had to adjust based on the new changes imposed by COVID.
Hi, good morning. My name's Caitlin, and as Kirby had mentioned, I'll be covering more of the wholesale retail side. So this won't involve any, live cattle data, numbers, or information. I predominantly work on the production and wholesale side down here in Napa. And so as what Kirby mentioned, a lot of the ranching side of our operation has fortunately not been affected. Because we have our operation down here in Napa, we have had that effect more on our retail side and restaurant side. In addition to having our own butcher shop in the Oxbow market, we also wholesale our beef products throughout the Bay Area. We sell to restaurants and grocery stores. We go as far north as Sacramento Valley. We do have a few accounts up in Nevada City, Chico, kind of a handful, but predominantly in San Francisco and surrounding Bay Area cities. And so just with the change, we all sort of, were affected in March is when, shelter in place started to get ordered through different counties, and we all had to adjust accordingly. And so what we found is that from February to March, our restaurant sales went down 17%. And then our grocery sales increased by 17%, making it an overall demand of our wholesale, 20% toward restaurant and 80% toward grocery stores. And so March, we really felt the impact. That was kind of when a lot of people were still in their panic buying. And so that was where that increase in grocery stores really came from. And so we were very fortunate to be able to supply them that product. Whereas on the flip side, the restaurants, most had to close their doors overnight, kind of sit back and evaluate how they wanted to proceed. Because initially they set up, takeout wasn't necessarily an option. So a lot of them just had to figure out what they wanted to do, especially with indoor dining completely out of the picture, as well as outdoor dining at the start of the whole pandemic. But overall, March, our wholesale increased by 8%. So that's where that demand came in from, kind of that panic buying in March. And then the months following after, our sales did decrease. However, we have consistently stayed at that 20% and 80% difference between the restaurant and grocery demand. We fortunately harvest our cattle here locally in Merced at Yosemite Valley Beef. So because they are a small facility, they just harvest beef cattle. We did not get a direct impact from COVID. We have been able to harvest on a weekly basis, the same number head of cattle. And so we have been able to have that steady inbound of new product weekly, which has been really nice. There had been a lot of concerns expressed from a lot of the grocery stores, especially at the time when plants throughout the nation were closing down. They were, expressing their concerns as to our supply to them. And so I think that's where it really helped that we are a small specialty niche product. And so they were very relieved that there weren't going to be a huge impact as far as our supply to them. Kind of circling back to our butcher shop there at the Oxbow Market, the retail sales there have probably remained the same, and that's just because due to the market protocols that Kirby had mentioned, only so many people were allowed into the market, and so that just didn't allow for that foot traffic to be there for direct sales and that face-to-face sale. But in lieu of that, we decided to launch our online sales platform. This was something that we had talked about for months on end and just never had the opportunity to get that done. So when COVID hit, that was just the perfect opportunity to be able to offer this new platform to purchase our beef product. So we kind of created it overnight. We just worked with what we had, updated our website, and just worked out the numbers and figured out how to make that work through our website and ship. In addition to that, we did also offer a local delivery within the Napa city limits just to support our local community, as well as pick up in store just for so there's an additional way for people to come and have that no contact sale. So that has been able to help us kind of alleviate the sales lost at the Oxbow. And so our sales online, of course, were good to start. We peaked in April and then since have kind of slowed down, but that's just also in light of kind of that panic buying. But anyways, these are some of the changes that we have, made due to the pandemic and to kind of figure out where we can put our sales through. And so we hope that things will start to, start getting back to normal as everyone hopes. But I do see that wholesale is still going to be a strong aspect of our program, more so on the grocery side. And then we hope that our mail order program will take off here even more.
So thank you, Caitlin and Kirby, for sharing with us your personal family operation stories and really getting an operational overview of how you have worked with your employees to remain safe following COVID guidelines, and how you've adjusted and shifted with the local markets to continue supplying locally raised beef. And so for those of you online, you can see their website and learn more about them at 5.ranch as well. Our third speaker and final one today is Morgan Doran, a UC Cooperative Extension Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor, serving ranchers in Napa, Solano, and Yolo counties. His research and extension program focuses on working with ranchers on topics from animal nutrition and natural resources to marketing and economics. Today, he's going to share with you about the regulatory challenges with on-farm sales and meat.
All right, thanks, Tracy, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. And so, yeah, as Tracy said, we're talking about the kind of that side of the supply chain that deals with some of the slaughter and processing and navigating the regulatory aspects of that. So you can advance to the next slide. So as everyone's been saying, we've seen a lot of disruptions due to COVID, and those disruptions often create opportunities that inspire a lot of creativity. And there's a somewhat famous quote by Paul Romer that it makes me think of, and that is a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. A lot of these disruptions that we saw were starting with of course, the supply chain, but also the canceled fairs that we were seeing across the state, the local county fairs that hosted junior livestock auctions. And as these started to get canceled, it forced a lot of ideas and alternative marketing opportunities. And so a lot of fairs, they went to alternative online auctions, either on the fairgrounds or off-site. And a lot of private sales were also done of those animals that these youth exhibitors were doing. And it's really outside of what they normally do, because they often just depend on and count on the junior livestock auctions to sell their animals. And so they had to be in a different mode of action and trying to do some private sales as well. So we also, as Tina was mentioning, we saw those incredible supply chain shortfalls. And what that inspired is a lot of people to seek local supplies for their meat. And that sometimes comes with some difficulty of trying to discover and navigate the local channels to alternatives to the normal supply chain, but at the local level. And that's not a overall fix for the supply chain shortfall, because the volume of beef that's moved through the normal channels is just so enormous that the local supply chain just can't fill that gap. But it certainly does have an impact, especially if you're the one who is trying to put meat in your refrigerator and on your table. So there are a lot of questions that do come to mind when you're thinking about how to do this and do it legally. How do you do the ranch slaughter? How do you sell animals or meat? And Kirby and Caitlin talked a lot about how they're doing it. Of course, they're doing it in a specific channel through USDA. One thing we did see, though, as one of the creative ideas, was people were talking about raffling livestock. And this was more on the youth exhibitor side. When the fair shut down, we started to hear about this, people wanting to raffle or do a lottery for their livestock animals. And we want to take that off the table right now, because it's not legal in California, and also in many other states, if not most other states, is that it's a game of chance, and it's not a legal way to sell your animals. So we'll take that off the table right now and not talk about it further. So let's first start off with the legal ways that you can sell meat. And this applies to beef, lamb, goat, pork. And the key words here are sell meat. This is what you have to do if you want to sell the meat. So first of all, the animal must be slaughtered at a USDA inspected facility and with a USDA inspector on site to look over the carcass, make sure it's not contaminated in some way. And it's a healthy animal. So once it's slaughtered, the carcass can be processed at that same facility if that facility does processing, or the carcass can be transported to another facility for processing, cut and wrap, basically, packaged. But that transport, they have to ensure that the carcass temperature is not going to go above a certain threshold. So it might require some climate control or very short transportation in a clean box or vehicle. So the carcass, for processing, it must be processed at a USDA inspected processing facility, or the carcass can be processed at a CDFA, which is the California Department of Food and Agriculture, inspected, or a county inspected facility. The one caveat here is that if it's a CDFA or county inspected facility, is that all the meat that is processed at that facility can only be sold at that same facility. It can't be transported to another storefront for sale, or it can't be transported to a restaurant for sale. It can only be sold from that facility. So there's been a lot of interest also in USDA inspected mobile slaughter units, and those do exist. We had one in California down on the South Coast, our Central Coast region, for operating for a while. So with regard to USDA inspected mobile slaughter units, is that the site, being the corral and the area immediately surrounding the corral, and the mobile unit itself, they must be USDA certified, and you have to have a USDA inspector at that site during the slaughter. And there are also local regulations that will need to be abided by, which usually deal with the water and blood disposal, offal disposal. So there's some factors if you want to sell the meat. It has to be USDA inspected with a USDA inspector on site. So another avenue is ranch slaughter. And this can be pretty common in some areas, more so than others. So with the ranch slaughter, the animal, it can be slaughtered by the owner of the animal, or which is more commonly done by a custom exempt mobile butcher. And there's a link, I think it just got posted in the chat, of CDFA. They have a list of licensed mobile butchers. So once the carcass is ready, it can then be transported to a custom exempt processor. Think of your mom and pop butcher shop. And so really key in this process is that records of the owner or owners name and address must be kept by the custom butcher and also the custom butcher and the processor. And in this case, the owner of the animal is the consumer. And it doesn't have to be just one owner. There can be multiple owners of a carcass, because it's probably unusual for one family to consume a whole beef carcass. It's a heck of a lot of meat. So that's often shared with other families, maybe 2 families or 4 families will go in together on that animal. And what they're doing is they are buying the animal. And that's another really important factor right here. And so the owners are the consumers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to say something about, oh, sorry, can you go back to the, yeah. So thank you. So the custom, I was mentioning custom exempt, and it's basically, it's an exemption that the USDA provides for personal meat that's going for personal use. And so it's a custom exemption, and it enters this custom exempt process as soon as you do a ranch slaughter. And that basically means that the meat cannot be sold. And as a result, any packages of the product have to be labeled not for sale. And so the owner is essentially paying for the services, the slaughter and the processing services. They're not paying for the meat. They're buying the animal and then paying for those services. And the meat can only be consumed by the owners of the animal, members of the owner's household, the owner's employees, and one item that got left off is the owner's non-paying guests. So this meat cannot go into the restaurant channels at all, can't be sold at all. So the livestock, they must be slaughtered on the owner's property. This was true for all animals, but now it's true only for lamb, goats, swine. In 2018 and 19, a series of laws were passed that created an exemption only for cattle. And this allows 5 cattle per month to be slaughtered on the seller's property. So without this, you can imagine you as a consumer, you wanted to buy an animal, you're not going to probably take it to your house or your property and kill this beef animal in your backyard. Not too likely. And so the exemption allows for the animal to be slaughtered on the seller's property. And one important aspect is that prior to the sale of the animal, a brand inspection is required. And I'll say a bit more about that in just a bit. All right, so another channel that can be used is taking the animal, the live animal, to a CDFA, California Department of Food and Agriculture, licensed custom slaughterhouse. If that's done, since it's not USDA inspected, it enters this custom exempt process. The meat can't be sold, and it's basically for personal use only, like it says right there, just the same for the ranch slaughter process. So some other considerations, as I mentioned before, a cattle brand is inspection is required prior to the sale of the animal. So you go to a rancher and you're going to buy that animal. Prior to the sale of that animal, a brand inspector must come out, inspect the brand, and ensure that the transfer of ownership is all on the up and up. And there is a link for the Bureau of Livestock Identification. You can find the brand inspector for your area using that link. Another consideration is how are you going to sell the animal? Animals are typically sold by weight, a certain amount of money per pound of live animal weight. If you do that, you have to have a scale that has a current certification by the Ag Commissioner, Sealer of Weights and Measures. And also, you have to have a licensed weighmaster be the person weighing that animal. It might be hard to come by in a lot of these kind of ranch scale transactions. So an alternative to that is to come to an agreement of a sale amount by the animal, so dollars per animal. That's an alternative way to make that type of a purchase. And just as in the normal commercial, if you can back up real quick, commercial or food supply process is that drug residues and withdrawal periods apply just the same. And over on the right, there's a drug label right there that shows the withdrawal time for this particular product, Draxxin. And so all drugs will have the withdrawal information on there, and that really does have to be observed, just as if it were the animal were going to an auction or through the normal food supply chain. All right, next slide, and this is the last slide, as these are some publications that are really useful in helping navigate the whole regulatory process and other aspects. And so Selling Meats and Meat Products has good flowcharts of legal avenues to process and sell meat, and also avenues that are illegal. This other USDA publication, Local Meat and Poultry Processing, it's a great publication. It really does emphasize the relationships that are necessary to make these local supply chains work. And it mostly focuses on the producer and processor, slaughter processor relationships, but it really does change things around, because the relationships that need to be had are those plus the producer-consumer relationships. So if you're venturing into this, the relationships are really critical. And I'm sure that Caitlin and Kirby can probably attest to that, is the relationships that they have with their customers are probably a lot different in this arena than they are with just the normal commercial route. And then there's this last publication, Livestock Sales for Meat Rules and Regulations. This is basically has been a fact sheet right now. We're working on getting this reviewed at the UC A&R publication. Basically covers a lot of the information that I just covered in this presentation, plus additional points. So I think that was it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all, and thank you, Morgan, for just sharing about the compliance and the regulations that producers look at before they go into direct marketing. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists to turn back on their videos, and we're going to move into some question and answer. So if you have a question, if you want to add that in the question and answer box, we will make sure our panelists get that answered. And so the first one that I had that just came up to mind, after listening to both Caitlin and Kirby talk about the challenges that they've dealt with in COVID, and Morgan really getting into the compliance and regulations, perhaps Kirby and Caitlin can kind of talk about what your family went through 12 years ago, and maybe what were the top 3 challenges that you had when you decided to enter this direct sales marketing to consumers.
So it's a long ways to think back, Tracy, 12 years and all the things that we've had to go through from then to now. I would definitely say, you know, it was a huge shift from going from a full-time ranching operation to taking on, you know, everything from marketing to creating a label and going through all of the, you know, making sure that we were following all the regulations for labeling and things and getting all of that sorted out. And once we did, one of the biggest challenges that we continue to face, and you know, this has been the case since we started, is talking to people about beef and you know, agriculture in general, and you know, explaining what we do and how you know, we are, by raising cattle, we're also stewards of the environment, and you know, answering people's questions on sustainability and regenerative agriculture and how we fit into that. So that continues to be a challenge. Unfortunately, agriculture is not something that a lot of people are that in touch with. So, you know, it's a constant, we're just constantly talking about it. Other challenges would include, back then, you know, we didn't really have to worry too much about beef alternatives, but now that is something that we're seeing coming into the market that we're trying to market our product alongside. So I would say that those are the three biggest challenges that existed back then and still remain today. So we continue to fight the good fight, as we feel.
Thank you for that. And moving on to the next one that kind of goes in line with those challenges, but looking at, you talked about the stewards of the environment, and maybe Tina and Morgan can follow up on that, is what opportunities do you see as the future outlook on the beef supply chain? And like, where do you see that there are options for ranchers to still remain sustainable economically, as well as they face these challenges such as COVID, drought, and the recent fires?
So I guess I'll start, and then Morgan, please follow up with things that I miss or things from your perspective. As Kirby mentioned, ranchers in California and across the US are acting as stewards of the environment. And by having their businesses on rangelands and pasture lands, extensive grazed landscapes, they really are providing a vast array of what we would call ecosystem services to consumers really across the globe. A lot of those services, like carbon sequestration, water purification, those types of things cannot be confined just to the ranch. Really, those producers, in having these beef operations extensively grazing, are supplying those to society at large. And they're doing so free of cost. So it's not that 5 Dot Ranch is getting payments from society for those services that they're providing. They're being good stewards of the land, partially because that improves their economic viability of their cattle operation. The better managed a ranch is, the more productive it will be as a grazing landscape, the more pounds of beef they can harvest off of it. But they are also providing us a service for what they're not being compensated for currently. Morgan, did you want to follow up with anything?
Yeah, so something that I wanted to bring up is some other people I've spoken to in the past several months have alluded to is this paradigm that I guess a lot of ranchers and agencies and consumers have, is that the paradigm is that ranchers are providers of a product, right? They raise a product, they raise an animal product, and then it's sold to the consumer. And as you're talking about the services that ranchers provide, it's not very commonly thought, or producers don't commonly think of themselves as service providers. And so it's really difficult to play in that arena if you don't have that mindset that I'm a provider of services, vegetation management, ecosystem services. And so it's not just the ranchers, though, that have that mindset of them being just providers of a product. I think it's the consumers, it's the the counties, it's the agencies also have that mindset that ranchers are just providers of a product, not of services. And so until there's a real shift in that paradigm, that way of thinking of ranchers as both service providers and product providers of a product, it's and once the paradigm shift is made, there can probably be some mechanisms that are created. And I know it's kind of a work in progress. It's happening in some places, but until that paradigm shift is done, really it's going to be difficult to find those mechanisms to pay for ranchers for those services that they do provide. Some are direct payments for contract grazing. Those are some direct payments for those types of services. But that's probably just like we're talking about these small meat markets. It's a niche. And just looking at the fires that we're seeing right now, a lot of these areas in Napa County and Solano County and Yolo County, a lot of them are grazed, but by and large, most of those areas are not grazed. They're pretty much unmanaged. So there's so many opportunities for those types of services to be provided in areas of California.
So I'd like to step in there. Thank you, Morgan. And I guess, the purpose of our whole webinar series was to reimagine our food system. And I think your point about the ecosystem services really helps springboard us to think about our food system differently and think about how ranchers get their payments. Currently, ranchers are going to get their payments by the sale of beef. And as Tina showed us, that's not a real stable thing. And in California, whether it's flood, fire, mud, or earthquake, we have some disaster right around the corner. So if we have the ability to reimagine our food system and figure out how to change that income stream so that folks like Kirby and Caitlin actually get income for the value of their cattle on the range, whether it's protecting endangered species, whether it's reducing the severity of fire, any number of things that their land management and those cattle do combine, then that's really the purpose of this webinar series, is to figure out how do we tilt the current food system and how do we get income for things that people haven't paid for previously, so that the sole income, in this case, going to a rancher, is not just from the beef, but also from the rest of the system. So I'd be real curious if any of the people participating today have some thoughts on that, and if they'd like to share it in the chat box, or if they'd like to go to annotate up in we need someone to share a screen so they could do that and annotate our PowerPoint. Tracy, I think you have that slide.
I'm not sure that I do. Rachel may have that one. So maybe why we're getting that technical difficulty figured out, maybe Morgan can expand on what have you seen or what opportunities do you see for ranchers to really capitalize on some of that new markets or potential alternative markets to just being paid for than beef?
Well, I think doing the things like what Kirby and Caitlin are doing is just creating the storefront, whether it's a physical storefront or online storefront, and making those relationships with the consumers. That's just a huge part of it, and that's where it starts. And that's how you develop your market. It's a lot of work, and it's not for everyone. Livestock producers are good at what they do, producing animals and meat. But they may not be good marketers, and there's a lot of footwork that goes along with raising an animal and taking that through the whole process to meet someone at the consumer. And so just think really hard about what it is you want to do, and maybe you want to sell to a branded program where you get a bit more premium for your product, or maybe you want to do the whole thing like what Caitlin and Kirby are doing. But it does require a lot of work, and they've been able to do it as a family. Probably, maybe you all could say more about that, because it seems like that's how you are able to do it as a family operation, and separation of responsibilities.
Can I tag on a question, Kirby, before you talk about it a little bit? Certainly you guys are managing your risk somewhat by having both branded beef and your commercial herd, but that also increases your financial exposure because you have more employees, you have the storefront, you have rent, you have real estate, all of these things. So it's a trade-off, I think, for you guys and for any producer trying to do it, with certainly risk and potential economic reward and sustainability. So I think that would be something really interesting if you guys could touch on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So to speak on all of this, and when we were historically a commercial cattle operation, and then we decided that there's only so much room for growth in our type of business, especially in California, with urban encroachment, and there's just not a lot of land available for what we do. So in order to continue supporting the growing family and making sure that our ranch remains sustainable in the future, looking at creating that branded beef product and starting on that new venture was very important to us, and something we decided to dive into. Having a restaurant, or the fast casual restaurant that we do, and the butcher shop wasn't something that we initially envisioned, and it just kind of took hold as we moved through the process. We started off in farmers markets, with our selling product. I spent a whole summer going from farmers market to farmers market, selling our product, and then we had the opportunity to open the butcher shop, which then eventually turned into the restaurant, and it's just morphed as we've gone along. And so we have been fortunate in the opportunities that we have, but it also comes with the challenges, like you mentioned, more employees, especially the type of business that we're in. In California, there's a lot of regulation and laws regarding employees, and how many hours they're able to work a day, and lunch breaks and things, and that's really hard to manage when you are sending a cowboy out to ride on the range, and they have to drive 2 hours away to move cattle. And the cattle, they don't respond to lunch breaks or other 10-minute breaks that employees are required to have in California. So it's extremely challenging in implementing all of that and making sure our employees are following the our employees are following the different laws and regulations in California. And like I mentioned before, that constant communication with the general public and consumers about what we're doing to, environmental stewardship of the land. So many people don't realize that, we're mitigating for endangered species, and we're creating a space for those species to thrive and alongside our cattle, and also improve their habitat, carbon sequestration, making sure that, the cattle are grazing the land properly to, for future use. It's a lot. It's a lot that we have to manage, that we have to work around, but we're doing it, and we definitely have seen a lot of risk associated with these new ventures, such as our branded beef product and whatnot. We've opened ourselves up to a lot, but at the same time, we also are proud to be able to speak on behalf of the ranching community and talk about what we do as ranchers. And it's an opportunity that we have that others may not, without that branded beef product or without that online platform or just that daily interaction with the actual customer or consumer. So there are some definite benefits along with the risk, but here we are, and we're doing okay so far. So let's hope that the future, we're able to continue into the future.
So building upon what Kirby just talked about grazing for the benefit of threatened and endangered species, in the last couple of years, we have seen a lot of public land agencies in California, as well as conservation organizations that are starting to reintroduce grazing as a management tool. And part of that, in terms of economic sustainability and looking at the food supply, is they're not actually basing the leases for that ground on highest bid, that they're actually looking at the ranchers and their stewardship ethic that Kirby just talked about, and their ability to graze, to create habitat for species such as tiger salamanders or Calipe silver spot butterfly. And so looking at ranchers to meet those management objectives, which I think can be a win-win as you look at a sustainable food system of, you know, ranchers being rewarded a little bit differently with possibly a lower lease rate because of their ability to meet those conservation objectives, as well as having you know, a ranching family that's vested in that property as well. It can be a win-win. We did have a question, and maybe, I think maybe it got answered, but, oh no, not yet. But maybe Morgan can talk about this. One of the questions from the audience that was said that they would looked into buying a share of custom slaughtered animals, but they believe the smallest share is 1/4 of an animal. Is there any way to get a smaller share? And so you just heard Kirby and Caitlin talk about their boxed beef that they're doing for their ranching operation, but also a number of other ranching operations that are using the USDA processors that are certified as an option can do boxed beef as well. But maybe Morgan can talk about the challenges that come from those on-ranch slaughters when you get smaller than 1/4 of a beef.
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult, and it kind of gets maybe into a gray area as far as selling meat. But I think what people do is that you just have more buyers of an animal, and what CDFA wants, they want to be able to have the ability to trace backwards and forwards the meat, so that if there ever is a problem with contamination or whatnot, they know who has the meat. They know where it's been. They know where it is, so that they can do full trace back. And so if there's interest in, you know, more than 4 people in sharing an animal, you can have 6 people. You can have 8 people. But they just need the ability to do that trace back. They need the information. And commonly there's like typically one person that would be maybe the lead person, the name who's maybe on the documents. But there has to be some kind of record somewhere so that all the names are accounted for.
So we are nearing the ending time of our webinar. We've actually gone over a little bit, but I think we've had some amazing discussions. And just to kind of maybe end this on a positive note, getting back to how can the consumer, and this goes back to also one of the question and answers, but how can consumers, everyday public in California, as well as farmers market organizations and other groups support local beef and animal production in a better way? So, and, you know, help you as livestock producers and the producers that both Morgan and Tina and I work with, and families like Kirby and Caitlin's continue to stay in business and produce sustainable beef for the local food supply. So we'll end with that. If you guys want to just add maybe a first thought that comes to your mind.
So I guess just to reiterate a little bit of what I typed, buy beef, essentially. So maybe in the immediate term, if you could find an operation like 5 Dot, or, you know, someone local to you that you trust and want to support, buying directly from them, whether it's a farmer's market, online, whatever venue you can, that will support the system. You can also support ranchers more broadly, regardless of their location, by purchasing beef, and also looking at labels and buying beef that you value. So maybe you want to start paying premiums for some of these ecosystem services we're talking about. There are some labeling efforts and some ranches that are trying to market those types of things. So vote with your dollar in that regard to maybe pay a little bit more for beef that you either know and trust locally, or who has credible labeling that you want to support the efforts that they are engaging on their ranches.
I'd also encourage people to, if you are shopping locally, trying to shop at farmers markets, to not be afraid to talk to your local ranchers, ask them questions, get to know who they are and how their operation works, and tell your friends and encourage them to support those people as well. Because it is a very intensive industry, and the more that we can reach out to the consumers and the general public, the better. So I would just encourage you to reach out to those people, talk to them, start a dialogue, and you'd be surprised in what you might learn.
Yeah, I'll second everything that's been said, and by and large, livestock ranchers or beef producers are good stewards of the land. And of course, there's your occasional bad actor, but by and large, they're all doing a great job managing the land. They need to in order to be sustainable. And if you have the means and the privilege of trying to pay something additional for the values that are important for you of ecosystem services, sustainability, maybe it's humane handling, and then seek out a producer, get to know them, just like what you're saying, get to know them, ask the questions, and develop that relationship. And like Tina was saying, you vote with your dollars.
So thank you again to Kirby, Caitlin, Tina, and Morgan for sharing your experiences and research and your family story today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Deanne and Lynn just to wrap it up and introduce the next webinar series.
Yes, so I'd like to say again a thank you, as Tracy did. I think it's very informative for the folks who were able to stick with us. And as a reminder, we did put lots of things in the chat. Those electronic pieces of information will be available after the webinar, probably about a week later, online as well, the recording of this. For folks interested in continuing with us on this series, as Lynn mentioned, we meet this second and fourth Tuesday of the month from 10 to 11. And our goal is to talk about how do we reimagine our food system. We all know our food system is incredibly fragile, and it's been put together to have very inexpensive food. And unfortunately, that also means that there's not much extra duplicity in the system. And by having some shoring up, as we've seen in the recent months, and certainly we in California know better than anybody outside about fires and the stress that causes on the supply chain. We're just trying to reimagine our food system so that every person in California can have nutritious food and go to bed and not be hungry. And when they get up in the morning, they can have a full meal. And if they're going to school, they can learn because they've got the right amount of nutrition. So our next webinar in the series is Thinking Inside the Box. We have 4 people who do not belong to UC-ANR who will be joining us about farm boxes and local supply chains. It should be just a real exciting webinar, as all of these have been. So certainly we thank folks for coming today. We've dropped in the link for the registration for next time. We hope everyone stays safe. And I'm thinking tonight it's beef, it's what's for dinner. So thank you so much to Kirby and Caitlin, and everyone be safe and practice all kinds of good health business given the smoke and our fires, and our thoughts are with all those who've lost so much. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing some of you in 2 weeks. Be safe.